Oh, no. Oh, stop it.
Wendy, welcome to this keynote speech in the 2021 Data for Policy Conference. And congratulations to Zainab and her team for another remarkable conference. I'm John Taysom. I'm the co-founder of the UK scale-up company Privitar, which provides the software for the NHS Safe Data Research Environment, the DARS program, which is based on some work I did on a fellowship at Harvard. I know Wendy because I was a trustee of her Web Science Trust for many years, and she's over many years become a great friend. I'm particularly pleased to introduce her today because she has a new book. And I'll talk in a minute about some of the things she's done in the past, but the new book is really a very important book, which is written with Kiran O'Hara. And I do commend it to you. It's full of interesting history and perspective. And I think it's an important book on the topic. Wendy, as well as her policy contributions, in the past was obviously a distinguished academic at Southampton. And I think highlighting some of the work in the past on linked data and how we really got to here is important in this context. Wendy's a pioneer in computer science globally. And it's fitting that she's now the chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. She was awarded her DBE in 2009, and in 2017 she co-chaired the UK government reform review of artificial intelligence in the UK, which resulted in the government funding about £1 billion allocating to machine learning and artificial intelligence. So she's had a real world impact. Questions, please, in the chat, and I'll try and put them to Wendy at the end. And Wendy, it's my pleasure to ask you to now present the conference speech.
Thank you. Right. Hello, John. Yes, John invested in my very first company back in the 90s. That's how we knew each other. And I'm trying again to slide share because I put it on an automatic. Let's try that one. I'm trying to do it on PDF because it will be quicker. Right, let's see. I'll do a view full screen and see what happens. There, is that okay? It seems to work. Is that okay, John? And we've got till 2:10, is that right?
Yes, and that's working fine.
Yeah, so I need to stop before that in case to allow for some questions. Okay, so yes, I've as John very kindly said, I have got a new book out, which I'm very proud of, about the internet. And we do talk about that. That's not the focus of my talk today in the sense of our geopolitical study of what's happening to the internet. I saw the security announcement last night. This is what's happening in security land is also what's happening in internet land. It's really very interesting and scary at the same time. But I'm not going to talk about that today because you asked me, well, I suggested I talk about our new social data foundation. And so that is what I'm going to go through with you today. Yeah, good. So as John said, leading into this, rather than going through my entire career, I was asked by the government in 2017 to do a review of artificial intelligence. That seems a long time ago. No, yes, 2017, yeah, 4 years ago. And in that review, which has been well talked about and publicised, there were 4 main recommendations, and then there was a separate one setting up the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. But the first one, Jerome Pesenti and I, Jerome was from industry and my co-chair, and the first set of recommendations were about data. And in fact, at the time, the government, the people we were working with at Number 10, wanted and expected us to put skills first. And I became the UK AI skills champion. That is my role on the new AI Council. But in fact, we put data first because we felt that the limiting factor for AI was access to quality data for outside of the big tech companies, across government, across civil society, and between industries, and data sharing and sharing of quality data is fundamental. And we felt that the UK had a number of assets, legacy, and on the way we are handling, thinking about data that could be our USP going forward. So we put that as our first set of recommendations. And I'm very glad we did, because that has, of course, skills are important, and everything else that we put in there, absolutely important. But we just, we really felt, now why isn't that? Oh dear. Can you hear me pressing a button and nothing happening? It's just frozen. Oh, right, let's start again. Good. Okay. So that turned into the sector deal, which injected a lot of funding into this area in 2018. You can see the ministers at the time. Interesting, the new, again, what happened last night, who's in charge of AI now? Oh dear. You know why this is not working, right? Because it's trying to install Java. What is it about computers that they have to so annoy you? So right, so anyway, the sector deal was we basically had a program of work. That also led to the setting up of an office for AI across DCMS and Bays, and the AI Council. Wow. And the council in February produced a roadmap, which you can see research and development, skills and diversity, data infrastructure and public trust, still hugely important in that, and also adoption across the board in government and industry. And in fact, I'm not sure how much I'm supposed to say, but there is a new AI strategy coming out, and I believe it's coming out next week. We always have to be very careful about dates, but we have all been invited to a reception. So I think you'll see something new on AI coming out from the UK government very shortly. So that's, ongoing. The government is continuing to put its foot on the accelerator in this world. So the other thing, as John said, I do is I chair the ADA Council. But before that, working with people like John and a colleague of ours who's very senior in the legal profession, we realized that although people were talking about data governance issues, and we're talking about data trusts, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and how you might set up data trusts. And the Open Data Institute's been doing a lot of work on this. There were very few, there was nobody really looking at what the legal mechanisms are for managing data on behalf of other people or other organizations, or joint ventures between organizations. And so very much actually at John's instigation, we set up a working group to look at this. And by the time we'd finished, we had an incredibly good team of people on it, lawyers, academics, people from the civil society work like the ODI, the Royal Society. And then we were able to persuade the Ada Lovelace Institute to actually be the secretariat for this, and it was published as a joint publication between Ada and the AI Council, which is the first such publication the AI Council had done, exploring legal mechanisms for data stewardship. And this has become a bit of a reference work for what you can do in terms of establishing governance mechanisms, which include legal and ethical compliances, as you're going about setting up the technical systems to enable data sharing between different groups of people. Now, I just want to say a word about data trusts here, because you'll see that we use the term a social data foundation, which is a form of data trust or data institution. In the UK, the data trust movement it has stemmed from the idea that you might set up a data trust to help individuals manage their data. Tim Berners-Lee is trying to do with this with Solid as well, because it's very clear at the moment that our data is all over the place, right? And whatever social networks you use, whatever bits of government you engage with, whatever businesses, whatever you do online, you've got a different bit of you, a different footprint of you in different organizations. And there's a very much a movement that says that data should come back to the individual. We should be responsible. We'll need third parties to help us with that, but we should be responsible for that data and who we share it with. So, but obviously for most people, that's got to be a very easy mechanism. So there's a movement about data trusts to use trust law in the UK to set up personal data trusts as a sort of bottom-up movement to make this happen. And as I said, Tim Berners-Lee's proposed his solid architecture to achieve that as well. This work is about how you set up a governance mechanism to enable data sharing between different organizations. In this case, a university, a hospital, and a city. In our example, of course, it's Southampton. So we have used for this. It's not we don't use trust law. Trust law is quite onerous in the UK, and you have to, you're actually giving your data to a trust to look after. We've used what our legal team at Southampton, our legal academics, called a social data foundation, because it's actually based on foundation law from the island of Jersey, which is another long story. Doesn't really matter. It's just a legal mechanism in terms of all we've done at the moment is sign a memorandum of understanding, which could over time become formal legal agreements between it, in our first example, these three institutions. And we hope to widen it out to areas beyond Southampton and to use it as a framework for other areas to develop their own ways of doing this. Now, again, my colleague Sophie Stella Bordelon, who is the professor of law at Southampton that we worked with very closely on this, taught me very early on that in order to set up this type of mechanism, you have to understand your purpose first, and then you can go about dealing with the detail of what you're actually going to put in your legal agreements, what your government's arrangements are going to be. But if you go away with no other message than what I'm going to say now, this is all about how you set up a technical operation for sharing data that includes within that a mechanism for checking legal compliance and ethical compliance. And you've got to define what you mean by that, right? In your memorandum of understanding documents and your legal contracts going forward. And you've got to understand that then you have a governance body that will manage the process and the compliance issues as they arise. But the basic day-to-day handling will be technical meets legal and ethical compliance. So that's absolutely key. And I'll just explain some of that. I'm not going to go through all. I realize I put far too many slides in. So, I'm going backwards again. Right. So this is the slide set we set up. Actually, I've just gone into that now in March this year to explain this to the heads of the three organizations as we were asking them to sign the memorandum of understanding, which they did in March, and we're now beginning to implement it. So joined up data equals our purpose in this. As Sophie impressed, we had to have a purpose. There's no one size fits all for these types of things. And our purpose is health and social care. The big issue is, and we've seen it in COVID all the time, is how, the hospitals, various hospitals have different, and hospital trusts manage their data in different ways. In Southampton, we have quite an advanced trust in terms of data management and sharing within the hospital, but there's absolutely no connection between the hospital records and the data in the city. And so when someone is discharged from hospital, their records don't go with them. And if any of you, like me, have had to deal with this in any recent time, you understand that patients go backwards and forwards between hospitals and social care. without records following them in any way, shape or form. And then you've got the university, which is offering to do research and data analysis on this to help make more efficient systems. And so how do they, either of those institutions or jointly or severally, share data with us as well? So, as I said, it's about accelerating access, and as John said, this is all about linked data. There's a lot of ontology work in here that I'm not going to go into today. It's about smart data management on platforms that automate legally compliant and ethical governance. I've said that. This is saying it in a different way, and then the three parties are the hospital and the city and the university, as I said. It's driven by unmet care needs. I've said about our first project, which we've agreed to do, is the seamless patient journey, how we can share data between the organizations to make it easier for the doctor, for the care workers, the health workers, and the patients themselves, and for us to get access to analysis, for data for analysis to support them in that. So that we're building systems to enable this. And then the issue with this is how you actually finally you talk about this in theory for forever, but actually getting to a point where you're sharing data. Anyone who's done this knows that is the hard bit. And we, I'm not even going to touch in this, I'm nearly halfway through the talk, I'm not going to touch on how the security issues, the managing the quality, how you check that your data's you've got all the data, and we're trying to manage that within the system, automate as much as possible, but that means very good governance all the way through. So again, this is all a three-way thing, and the key thing, again, I'll say it, we are not trying to put all the data in one place. The owners of the data keep the data, so it's all about the governance issues of sharing and the standards we develop to actually, ontologies to define the linked data, so that when a patient goes from a hospital out into the city, we know who that is, what's happened to them, and what is where they're going to be placed, and can track them through the system. And it's all federated. This is not about creating huge data lakes. Please don't think that. And I think most people understand now that this world is about federated systems, not huge data lakes. There are occasions when you need data lakes, but it's mostly a federated approach. So the governance issue is, as I said, the foundation is a source of institution. That's a data institution, which is the term the Open Data Institute uses. And it's I'm now going to just give you a slide about what our framework, the data foundation framework is, this was developed first by Sophie and her team, and then we've picked it up on the technical side of the fence. So there are 6 components for good data governance. These are relatively well agreed, and Sophie talks about them in her papers. Right, a trust-enhancing governance and technical architecture, that's absolutely crucial. An independent governance body, which we have now set up in our Southampton instantiation of this. An inclusive decision-making body, which is the people that will manage the projects on a day-to-day basis. A standardized process for flexible membership, because we want to bring new people into this, a comprehensive rule book, and a well-regulated legal structure. So everybody knows who's responsible for what. This is all work in progress, I have to say. I must stress that here. So what we're trying to do in terms of accelerating data sharing is enabling people, and I haven't mentioned this before, because a lot of the time organizations don't know what data they've got. Let alone other people from outside being able to say, oh, you've got this data set on COVID, can we use it? Being able to even publicize what data sets you've got and what format they're in and under what conditions you can access them, whether within a closed group like a data foundation or a wider group. We feel very strongly that we need local solutions within a national guiding framework. And that's what I'm working with the Office for AI and the AI Council on, in that we feel the government's not, I mean, there are clearly things government has to control, but it's in what we're talking about here, we think the efficiencies and the better methods of delivery will happen locally under guidance from national leadership. And some of that guidance, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work on digital twins as well. And it's all about how the standards you use for sharing the data. And I'll make the point here that, you know, I go back, of course, you know, because of my internet work and the World Wide Web work, I go back to when Tim Berners-Lee announced the standards for the World Wide Web, which were just basically two standards, HTTP and HTML. And everything else has flowed from that, good and bad, but largely good. And it's very socio-technical. You can't think of this from just a technical point of view. And when we were starting, when the web was starting, we didn't think about any of these things. And the web was just about linking documents to start with, which is a lot easier than linking data. But it was still quite difficult to people to accept, you know, a global standards, no matter how simple they were, a global set of standards. And Tim built it on top of the internet standards that were already there, very distributed, open access and free for everyone to use, and those are the sorts of principles we want to get into the national leadership in this area. Is what are the, so that, you know, the data, let's call it a data, I don't know if everyone will adopt this word, but call it a data foundation in Southampton can talk to a data foundation in Wolverhampton or Stirling or Belfast, or, you know, so that you can, as people move around, you can exchange information between data foundations. Again, you'd have to build that so that it was legally and ethically compliant, as well as technically sound and trustworthy. We're looking to empower citizens, and built into our data foundation principles is the involvement of citizens in the way we set it up. So that we feel is really important. Greater assurances that best practice data governance is followed. So publicising what we do, and being squeaky clean on it, and actually, you know, setting up the data governance board is one of the most important things that we're doing in this. And to give the organisations that are involved a sense of ownership, and faster ethical oversight and information governance, rather than at the moment where anytime you want a data set, you have to go and sort out what you're going to do with that one data set, right? Everything has to be repeated. And a lot of the stuff in COVID was done under emergency powers. This is all being sort, you know, the National Health Service has got to worry about all these issues, but you can't boil the ocean. So we're just doing this example in Southampton to start with, and we hope others will copy, do something similar, not copy just verbatim, but take similar practices, develop similar practices. Now, these slides I'm going to whiz through because it is already coming up to 2 o'clock, and I'd really like to take some questions. And I'm just going to, you can have the slide set, the organisers can send it round. I've also put the link in earlier for the paper, which all this stuff is in. But these slides, this is how we're building the system, and I'm not going to dwell on them. I'm going to flick through quite quickly to get to the last slide. There's 3 or 4 of them here. This just sort of tells you the basic setup, and you can see the sign for the factory is where the data is, right? This is federated. You've got your governance board, oversight, compliance. It looks like a lot of people. At the moment, it isn't, but over time, it could be. And how much money you spend on this. I know I talked to John a lot about, he has lots of good ideas about how you might fund this sort of activity to scale up. And we're working on the island of Jersey to do this, because that's where we got the idea of the foundation from in the first place, because it's a microcosm of what you could do on a bigger island. But we're starting quite small, and with one project, which is, as I say, about complex patient discharge, or is that the right phrase? So again, there are lots of different scenarios for the way you can set things up, and that's what this slide denotes. You can, when I say it's federated, there are many different ways of doing that, as to who's, because not every organization has the ability to establish mature data hosting sites. And so for some applications, it might be better for one or other of the organizations in the foundation to host the data at a particular time, or you might be fully querying across a completely decentralized multi-party data sharing initiative. So you can go from fully to decentralized to fully centralized, but it's not, none of this implies that you have to have a fully centralized data lake, right? You can have varying types of distributed access. You've seen some of this slide before, and you've got the architecture that we're building on the right. We're thinking about ways of actually, what's the system, what is the system we're building that will enable all this to happen? This is still work in progress. And that's the blow up of the system. And again, it's that goes how you manage the federated queries for a complex query. That's something that's still really a matter of research. So we've, as I said, we've started, we are developing our Smart Data Foundation platform, the technical, building in the risk management and the evaluation and validation of what we're doing. And that's one aspect of what we're doing. And then there's the data-driven care transformation, right, is our first project. I don't think I'll flow on that one at all. So this is I think the last slide in the stack. These are the first practical steps that we're taking. Many of you will have heard the term TRE, for a trusted research environment. What we're building is is an example of a trusted research environment. We are talking about existing data sets. I can't see some of that because it's under the windows. Discovering curation across pseudonymized data. And I'll say again here, with John sitting on the line, we're working with Privitar, a company that he's been very involved in helping set up, which is technology in privacy. What's the phrase I want? Privacy technology. You're using technology to enhance privacy. What's the phrase I want, John?
You're almost there. Privacy enhancing technology.
Yes, privacy enhancing technology. Sorry, I haven't been very well. This is my first and I've been doing the ref. It's my first presentation for ages. So forgive me. We are working closely with Privitar, who already have a contract with the NHS. Because privacy is absolutely vital to this. And so those sorts of technologies are absolutely crucial to what we're doing. And links directly to the SDF through the governance activities. We don't see the governance board meeting more than 3 or 4 times a year unless there's a crisis. As I said, the decision makers will be identified. There's a lead in each of the organisations, and we call them the operations group now. They will meet much more regularly, and we are, we're actively working on setting up our first example. So I don't have any slides from that, but that's the approach. This is the approach we're taking, and I think that's where I wanted to finish today. And I'm happy to take questions if any of you have made any sense of what I said.
Wendy, I can't resist the opportunity of asking the first question. I can't see anything in the chat. I don't know whether anyone has put something I can't see, but in the absence of other questions, Wendy, I'm dying to ask you a question. It seems to me that what you're working on in Southampton, and a culmination of a lot of things you've been doing at Ada Lovelace and before, is to change the dialogue from data as a liability, which has been the sort of last decade really, to data as an asset, and something we can make use of for the greater good. And taking a historic perspective, you could argue that capitalism had its infancy when a legal innovation allowed assets to be managed by other people on behalf of the shareholder owners. And that allowed us to have what we now call capital. And then roll on to the 1800s, and you had to have people to staff these new companies that had been formed around that legal innovation we call the Companies Act. And that legal innovation was the introduction of the pension fund trust, which allowed people to leave their land to come and work for a company for their working life, but to be provided for the whole of their life. And that allowed us to have labor capital. And it seems to me what you're doing with another legal innovation is to allow us to have data as an asset. Does that sort of chime with you, or do you think I'm being a bit too romantic?
Well, you know it does, John. And in fact, I'm glad you said it, because audience, this is what John and I are working on. He's the champion on that side of the fence. He understands how this works. And there is a question in chat that's come up that's very interesting. And I absolutely firmly believe in what you're suggesting there, John. I think that this is a coming together of the technical with the legal and loosely ethical, so audit frameworks, actually, because I don't know how I feel about ethics in AI in the general. We can talk about it till the cows come home, but actually it's going to come down to quite pragmatic things like auditing and ethics in data governance, the same, data sharing, data exchange. It's going to come down to auditing, just like we do with in the finance world, where companies have to say what they're doing with your finances and have to submit accounts every year to prove that they are working within the overarching regulations, and they are audited according to, and I think that's what will happen with these types of data sharing arrangements, that there will be people will have to say what they're doing, just to, tick some boxes to say we're worrying about that, we've got this under control, and I think this answers Ronnie's second question a little bit, is that some of it will be self-regulation and some of it will be fulfilling regulation that government sets, and that's where I think that that's where we'll be able to use data as an asset in the way that you're describing, because then companies can think about, because we are talking here about really public sector work, but when you talk about companies sharing data between each other or with citizens, then you're into a whole, who gets the value out of that. Can I answer Ronnie's question? Can an individual control personal data like solid pods? Ronnie, in this example, no. I do see down the line, though, that I would love us to be using solid, so that people could have their own pods, and then our system would access the pods. But that doesn't exist at the moment. So we're trying to work on the other side of the fence, which is how the organizations get access to data that's in another organization, which then could be. So I'm not trying to reinvent what Tim's doing. We would work with him on that, with Solid or Inrupt, the company, or with people who are developing data trusts using trust law, if that takes off. But that's not there at the moment. And then you said who controls the organizations? Well, the organizations have their own governance bodies. So, but again, as I said, it's very much that it's not the end organizations that it could be, but it's the governing body would have to answer to the government in terms of whatever regulations the government eventually set up for managing this type of data institution. I don't know.
Wendy, Nai's asked a very interesting question as you were speaking there, which in a way I think is at the center of some of this. What she's asking is, in terms of what gets audited or is determined to be a harm, that seems like a political question. In other words, it should be determined by citizens ultimately. How is that collaboration and citizen engagement configured, and how do you imagine it developing?
Well, this is a complicated question. I mean, if you're talking about managing social media companies, what determines what's the harm? I mean, these are incredibly difficult questions. For governments to work through. With what we're doing, each of the bodies involved at the moment, I mean, I don't know how it's going to evolve in the future, but each of the three types of organisations we're looking at the moment have their own governance bodies and have their own privacy policies for how they manage the data. They're at the data that they store. So the university has the data about its research, its students, its staff, and the hospital about the patients, and the city about the citizens it takes the care of. At the moment, our citizen engagement will be in terms of working groups that will talk to people about what we're doing and get the feedback back. It's that sort of engagement at the moment is what we're talking about here. But again, as I said right at the beginning, you have to understand the purpose of what you're trying to do in order to decide what your governance board is going to do. Sophie taught me that way back at the beginning of the project. So it really does depend on we're just one example of a myriad that can emerge in how you manage data sharing. And as I said, I do a lot of work with digital twins, and there will be many, many, many different types of digital twins, and potentially, a town can have a digital twin, and a hospital can have a digital twin, and a person can have a digital twin down the line, and an infrastructure like the national grid, or where it started with buildings can have digital twins, and there's the possibility of an ecosystem where all these things can exchange information, and the role the citizen plays in that is going to be quite complicated.
Wendy, Zainab has her hand up, and I'm going to ask her to join in just a second. But just to, I think nice question is such an important one. It seems to me in COVID we've learned there's some data that we should probably always share, and there's some data that, however ill we are, we should probably never be made to share. And there's sort of two ends of the barbell you can probably sketch out relatively quickly. The bit in the middle, I think, is going to take a lot more work. But Zainab, can I just ask you to join and put your question?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Wendy. It was really great.
Hello, Zainab.
Very, very pleased that you're here. Basically, you have you could join basically us for this keynote, and thank you, John, for the great sharing as well. Just a very common question that I get all the time about the data for policy conferences as well, and in some other contexts. When we say data for policy, sort of immediately first things that we talk about is data, the data related issues directly. But when we try to incorporate AI conversation in it, sometimes it looks like we are getting some reaction. So I want to really talk a bit more about, I want to open sort of the conversation a bit more about in that direction, how much data issues are separable from AI issues, or how much AI and data issues are inseparable, basically. If it makes sense.
I just take from a logic, but of course, when you're talking about AI, you have to talk about data issues. You can talk about data issues without AI. And today, AI today is really machine learning being trained, algorithms being trained on lots of data, and that AI is a much broader term than that. So there are types of AI that don't involve data at all at the core. But if you're talking about what most people are today with AI, which is machine learning and deep learning, then that's all about training data on large data sets, which we all know is going to have huge benefits for society, particularly in healthcare, but also brings with it potential harms. And that's a subject of big discussions around the world about how you regulate AI. So they are joined at the hip. Is that an expression I can use? They are separable. But the way things are at the moment, it's very difficult to have a discussion about big data sets without thinking about what you're going to use, how you're going to allow that data to be used by people who are building AI algorithms. And similarly, if you're thinking about AI, you absolutely have to think about your data governance issues. So they are, and you look at just an example is what we talk about this in our book a lot, about what, for example, what the European Union are doing with data and AI. They developed GDPR, and the UK is going to have a new look at that and see what we might want to do with that going forward. It doesn't mean we want to stop protecting people's data, but it may be we want to develop more lightweight mechanisms about it. And then also the EU have come out with their AI ethics work paper, which is typically very bureaucratic in their approach. The Chinese have just come out with a set of 32 rules for, they put it out for consultation for managing how they frame it in terms of algorithms. And it's very interesting to see how different, again, how the US is doing it as well. This is what we talk about in the book, how different countries, different cultures are managing governance in this space. But I think the actual answer to your question, Zainab, is joined at the hip, if that's okay.
Wendy, we're
running out of time, aren't we?
We're just about out of time, I think. Can I just thank you? It's easy to talk about complex things in a complex way. It's very hard to talk about complex things in a precise but simple manner. And it's a great talent that you've got. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody.
Oh, my pleasure, John. Thank you. It's always good to work with you. And thank you, team, for putting the conference on. And I hope you managed to get something, all of you, from the talk, and we'll follow our work with interest. Thank you.
We definitely will. Thank you very much, Wendy and John. We're going to take a break now and see you at 20 to 3.